Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
Thanksgiving has always been one of those holidays that carried more tension than warmth for me, though I never admitted it out loud. The house smelled of roasted turkey, cinnamon pies cooling on the counter, and that faint edge of stress that only a family gathering can create, the kind that sits just under your skin and makes you brace for the next comment you wish you could unhear. The table was already set, the good china that only came out twice a year gleaming under the overhead lights, and every seat was filled except for mine. My brother and his wife had arrived early, of course, to showcase their latest accomplishment, and it took less than 10 minutes before my mother was holding court at the head of the table, her voice syrupy and proud, as if she were announcing the arrival of royalty. "Can you believe it?" she gushed, turning toward my aunt as though she had been waiting for the right cue. "Daniel just bought a beautiful house. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a yard big enough for the kids, and a kitchen that looks like it belongs in a magazine." She leaned forward as though she could see the glossy countertops in her imagination, eyes glowing with admiration, her words thick with pride that seemed reserved only for him. Everyone murmured in appreciation, nodding along as if they had all personally contributed to the down payment. I sat down quietly, sliding into my chair with the kind of practiced smile you put on when you know your role is not to shine but to observe. Daniel puffed out his chest, his wife clasping his arm like he had just won an Olympic medal instead of locked himself into 30 years of monthly mortgage payments, and I sipped my wine, pretending not to notice the way my mother's eyes skimmed right past me like I was another piece of the table setting. It didn't take long for the attention to shift. My cousin asked about the neighborhood, my aunt inquired about school districts, and my dad, who had been mostly quiet up to that point, added that buying a house really shows a man's maturity. I could feel the words sliding across the table, wrapping themselves around me like chains, pressing down on me with that familiar weight. My fork scraped lightly against the plate, and I forced myself to keep smiling, though my jaw was so tight I worried it might crack. Then my mother, never one to leave a wound unpoked, turned directly toward me, her voice soft but sharp enough to draw blood. "So, sweetheart, when will you finally settle down? Don't you think it's time you grew up a little, found something stable, maybe even gave us something to brag about too?" She laughed, the kind of laugh meant to sound lighthearted, but filled with every ounce of judgment she'd been storing for years, and the table followed suit, chuckles bouncing off the walls like echoes in a cave. For a moment, I just stared at her, the stem of my glass balance between my fingers, and I thought about every Thanksgiving that had come before. The years when my achievements were brushed aside, when my promotions or projects or even just surviving another year on my own barely warranted a passing comment, while Daniel's smallest steps were paraded like miracles. I thought about the birthdays they forgot, the calls that went unanswered, the times I showed up anyway, only to leave with that hollow ache of never being enough. The weight of all those years pressed down on me in that moment, but instead of shrinking, instead of fumbling with excuses or trying to defend myself, I felt something else entirely rise up in me. It was calm, not the kind of storming rage that makes you lash out, but the kind of clarity that settles in your chest when you realize you don't owe anyone an explanation. I let the silence stretch just long enough for them to notice, for the laughter to falter, and then I smiled, slow and deliberate. "Oh, I already did," I said, my voice steady, carrying across the table like a secret being unwrapped. I could see the confusion flicker in their eyes, the quick glances bouncing between them as though they had missed a chapter in a story they thought they knew by heart. I leaned back, the smile never leaving my face. "I just didn't invite anyone who doubts me." The words hung in the air like smoke, curling into every corner of the room. My mother's fork slipped from her fingers, clattering against the porcelain with a sharpness that made everyone flinch. My father froze mid-bite, his jaw locked tight. Daniel blinked rapidly, as if trying to compute a joke he hadn't been told, and his wife's hand slipped slightly from his arm. For the first time in years, the room was utterly silent, every set of eyes turned toward me, waiting for me to elaborate, to fill in the blanks, to give them the satisfaction of knowing what I meant. But I didn't. I let the silence do the work. I let their curiosity dig into them, deeper and deeper, because nothing unsettles a family that thrives on control more than the realization that they don't know everything about you. The wine slid down my throat smoothly, the only sound in a room that had been buzzing with noise just moments earlier, and I could feel the shift, subtle but irreversible. I had them exactly where I wanted them, and I wasn't about to give anything away, not yet. The silence that followed my line did not break quickly. It stretched like a taut wire humming under the weight of all the unasked questions and all the years of practiced assumptions, and while the room waited for an explanation that would make them comfortable again, I took a slow breath and tasted not only the oak of the wine, but the close metallic tang of old disappointments that, for the first time, no longer felt lodged in my throat, because I had decided a while ago that I would stop letting other people name my life, and if this table needed to sit with uncertainty for a while, then so be it. In that breath, I found the memory of a previous Thanksgiving when Daniel announced a job title that sounded important mostly because it took 3 lines to print on a business card, and Mom, beaming as if she had delivered him herself that morning, leaned across me to refill his glass while saying she just loved it when her children made responsible choices, and I remember how I placed my hands in my lap to keep from clapping for myself, because that week I had signed a contract that scared and thrilled me in equal measure, a contract that would quietly reroute my life, though no one at that table knew and frankly no one asked. It is funny how a family can turn your choices into a mirror that only reflects their expectations and never your reality, how each holiday becomes a stage where the same lines are rehearsed, the same compliments doled out, the same sideways glances thrown like paper darts that never draw blood but somehow bruise anyway, and I had learned to sit straight and take it, promising myself that the day would come when I simply stopped translating myself for people who had no interest in learning the language. The first time I practiced that refusal, it was not elegant, it was clumsy and a little mean, which I will admit without apology because I am not applying for sainthood. And it happened on a heavy summer afternoon when my mother called to ask whether I was finally done with my little project and ready to get a real job, and I said, with a calm that surprised us both, that my little project had just paid my rent for a year, and that while I appreciated her financial sermons delivered from the pulpit of a house partly paid for by my grandmother, I would be managing just fine. Thank you. And after she hung up rather dramatically, I sat on my floor among folders and drafts and invoices and laughed in a way that felt like oxygen entering a closed room. There were quieter victories too, the kind that do not look like fireworks, but change your sky nonetheless, like the afternoon I met with a mortgage officer who spoke to me like a grown woman with a plan, not a child playing house, or the evening I signed a document with a pen that left a thin blue groove on my finger, and walked out into air that smelled like rain and cut grass, and felt the hard little joy of knowing that no one at my parents' table would believe it if I told them, which is exactly why I did not. At the Thanksgiving table, Daniel finally recovered his voice and tried to turn my line into a joke, because that was his defense against anything he could not categorize, and he chuckled that maybe I meant I had adopted a cat or joined a meditation cult. And a burst of relieved laughter skittered around the plates, as if the room had been waiting for permission to reset itself, but I only tilted my head and asked him how the mortgage points worked out in the end, because the last time we had spoken he mentioned something about an adjustable rate that sounded like a snake coiled in a corner, and he blinked in that way people do when they realize the conversation has slipped from the story they wanted to tell into the terrain of facts they preferred not to discuss. My father cleared his throat in a way that said I should behave, and my mother placed one hand flat on the tablecloth as if steadying the ship, and my aunt, who has always loved a sideshow as long as it does not involve her, leaned forward as though my next words might come with popcorn. For a moment I almost relented, almost let them herd me back into the corral of the compliant daughter, but then I saw it again, the subtle trim around their eyes, the reflex that assumes my news would be quaint at best, and I felt a private steadiness that I had earned the hard way, and I knew that I would not be gift-wrapping my answers for an audience that confused curiosity with entitlement. What I did offer them was a story they could not immediately digest, a careful, pointed recollection disguised as small talk. About a former landlord who once told me that stability is not a finish line but a set of decisions you make when no one is clapping for you, and how I had learned to stop asking for applause and start writing my own metrics, and how that shift had a way of rearranging what you called home and who you allowed to cross its threshold. I watched their faces as the meaning landed in pieces, some catching it quicker than others, and I saw my cousin look at me with a flicker of respect that had never been there before, while my mother pressed her lips together in the way she does when a conversation refuses to be controlled. The turkey went around the table and I served myself, grateful for the small choreography of passing dishes that gave my hands something to do, while inside I returned to the ledger I have been keeping for years, not of money or praise, but of choices and consequences, kindnesses offered and dismissed, apologies owed and postponed, and I thought about how every family holiday is an audit of that ledger whether you name it or not. I decided, as gravy pooled and the cranberry sauce glowed like a warning light, that I would collect what I was owed in a currency they would understand, not with shouting or ultimatums, but with boundaries sharpened into instruments, with invitations withheld, with information released on a schedule that served me, not the storyline that had reduced me to a supporting character. When dessert plates appeared and the children were shepherded toward a movie in the den, my mother tried again, softer this time, asking if perhaps I could share a little more about what I meant, because it would help her worry less if she knew I was safe. And there was a moment I almost told her everything just to soothe the ache that her voice still holds for me, that echo of wanting to be held without being handled. But I remembered all the times my safety was measured not by what made me whole, but by what made them comfortable, and I smiled with a warmth that was not false, but was very firmly mine, and I said that I would be happy to tell her something after dinner, perhaps just the two of us in the kitchen. And I saw the relief and the suspicion battle in her face before she nodded and said that would be nice. I stood to help with the coffee, knowing that the kitchen would be our little stage, that the clatter of cups would cover the sharp edges of what I was about to say, and that the first of several small, deliberate acts of revenge would be served not on a platter, but in a sentence she would not know how to swallow. The kitchen became the place where the air shifted, though no one else seemed to notice it at first, and I remember standing by the counter with the hum of the refrigerator behind me, the clatter of forks from the dining room echoing faintly through the doorway, and my mother placing cups in a neat row as though the perfect symmetry of porcelain could restore a balance that had been unsettled at the table. She cleared her throat in that overly delicate way she used when she was about to pry under the guise of care, and with her back half turned to me she asked if I was really all right, if I wasn't just saying things to make a scene, if perhaps there was something I wanted to confess without Daniel and the others listening. I watched her shoulders stiffen as she poured coffee, her hand trembling just enough for the liquid to ripple in the cup, and I realized she already suspected that I had been holding a life she knew nothing about, which terrified her far more than the idea that I might have been failing. I decided to lean into that fear, not cruelly, but with a deliberate precision that felt like reclaiming ground that had been stolen piece by piece over years of being treated as though my story had no chapters worth reading. I told her calmly that I had stopped waiting for their approval long ago because I understood that no matter what I did, they would never see it clearly. Their eyes were trained only to spotlight Daniel. And that blindness had freed me from the exhausting cycle of trying to prove myself to people who preferred their illusions over the truth. She tried to interrupt, but I continued, explaining that success is not always loud, that sometimes it is built in the quiet hours when no one is applauding, and that I had made decisions to protect myself from the very cycle of judgment she was repeating even in this moment. Her face tightened as if the words stung more because they were true, and for a moment she looked older, not from age itself but from the weight of realizing that she had missed years of my life by choosing not to look closely. When we returned to the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted again, though no one would have admitted it. Daniel was in the middle of one of his long-winded stories about the challenges of moving into a new house, embellishing details until they sparkled like medals pinned to his chest, while his wife nodded and added small flourishes to the tale, each designed to amplify the impression of their perfect new chapter. The others listened politely, though I noticed the way my cousin's eyes occasionally flicked toward me, curiosity written plain on her face, as though she had caught just enough of the earlier exchange to realize that something unsaid lingered like a storm cloud. I let Daniel speak, let him pile on detail after detail about square footage, neighbors, and plans for remodeling, and then I chose my moment with surgical care. I asked casually whether he had managed to sort out the refinancing issue he mentioned a few months ago, the one that seemed tricky because of the student loans still under his name, and the silence that followed was not immediate, but it spread quickly, like ink through water, as he fumbled for a response. His wife shot me a sharp look, his face flushed, and my father leaned back with a sigh heavy enough to rattle the ice in his glass. It was not an explosion, not a dramatic confrontation, but the subtle deflation of a balloon that had been floating too high for too long. And I watched with a quiet satisfaction as the room adjusted to the new awareness that his story was not as seamless as they had been led to believe. The conversation stumbled forward after that, but the rhythm was broken, and I could feel the tension rising like heat under the surface. My mother tried to redirect by asking if anyone wanted more pie. My aunt whispered something about real estate markets being unpredictable these days, and Daniel muttered a joke that fell flat, his usual confidence leaking away in front of everyone. I leaned back in my chair, the stem of my wine glass cool between my fingers, and thought about how small acts of truth can be the sharpest kind of revenge, not because they destroy someone, but because they reveal the cracks in a story carefully painted over for years. By the time dessert was finished, the table had split into small conversations, but I noticed the sideways glances still landing on me, quick and uncertain, as though everyone was waiting for me to break the suspense and reveal the missing pieces of my own life. I offered nothing, only smiles that hinted at secrets, and with each withheld detail I could feel the balance of power shifting, subtle but undeniable, away from their judgment and toward my silence. As I gathered plates and listened to the murmur of voices trying to rebuild the evening into something ordinary, I knew the question would come again, perhaps sharper, perhaps softer, but inevitable, and I was already prepared for it. What they didn't realize was that each time they pressed, I would answer in a way that unsettled rather than satisfied, feeding their doubt instead of their control. Because sometimes revenge is not about a single dramatic strike, but about letting someone live with the gnawing awareness that they no longer hold the script to your story. And when my mother's eyes met mine across the table, questioning, searching, I held her gaze until she looked away, and in that moment I understood that the unraveling had only just begun. The hours of a holiday have a way of elongating themselves until every minute feels like a small stage on which people perform the roles they have been assigned since they were old enough to hold a fork. And as the evening stretched toward that peculiar quiet that comes after dessert, when children yawn theatrically and uncles pretend to care about football highlights while tracking the dwindling level of bourbon in their glasses, I sense the next turn coming the way you sense a storm before. The first drop of rain lands, not in anything anyone said outright, but in the way attention began to circle back toward me with the hungry curiosity of people who smell a secret and cannot tolerate the unknown for very long in their own house. My mother, who had been watching me with a new caution that made her look like she was relearning my face, asked in a tone carefully balanced between concern and command whether I would help her pack leftovers for the neighbors, because Mrs. Klein across the street had recently had knee surgery and her husband was hopeless in the kitchen, which, as any member of our family would tell you, was exactly the kind of benevolence that allowed my mother to feel like a saint while orchestrating the narrative at home. And I followed her into the kitchen not out of obedience, but because I understood that some conversations need walls that can catch the ricochets when words hit hard surfaces. The kitchen counters were crowded with the afterglow of the meal, a chaos of tins and foil and bowls nested in other bowls. And as we assembled tidy parcels of turkey and potatoes, my mother began with a soft preface that I recognized as the overture to a cross-examination, saying that she had always wanted both her children to be safe and happy and respected, that in a world designed to take the knees out from under you it mattered to have a family to lean on, and that if she had ever made me feel small or overlooked, it was certainly not intentional and probably a misunderstanding that we could correct now if I would just help her understand what I meant by having settled down without inviting people who doubted me. She did not cry, because she does not cry in conflict, but there was that brittle shimmer in her voice that usually made me fold. And for a moment I held the container lid in my hand and let the silence stretch so that I could decide whether I wanted to ease her discomfort or finally speak in a way that did not center it, and I chose, with the steadiness I had earned, to speak without apology. I told her that I believed she loved me, and that love had been expressed in casseroles delivered after dental surgeries and gas money slipped into envelopes during lean months, but that her love had also been filtered through a hierarchy she never questioned, where Daniel's milestones were miracles while mine were curiosities to be interrogated, and that I had grown tired of arriving at family events as a defendant in a trial for which the verdict had been written years ago, and that, to put it plainly, I had designed a life that fit me, and the door to that life did not swing open for anyone who insisted it be arranged to flatter their expectations. She bristled at that and said families ask questions because they care, and I said families sometimes ask questions to maintain control, and she said control was a harsh word, and I said it was the only accurate one I had left, and then, because I am not cruel and because I wanted her to know this was not theater, I told her one true thing that could not be minimized into a hobby, which was that earlier this year, alone and without fanfare, I had signed the papers to a place I chose for myself. A place that had tall windows and a cranky radiator system and a narrow balcony where the morning sun stood like a loyal friend. And that the keys now lived on a ring in my pocket not as a symbol for anyone else, but as a quiet assurance to myself that the ground beneath my feet was my own. I did not tell her the address, and I did not tell her the purchase price, and I did not invite her to come see it, because I had learned that some revelations must arrive as a contour rather than a map if they are to remain yours, and I watched the way the knowledge changed her posture, how her shoulders dropped half an inch, as if something heavy had been set down without her permission. She asked, almost in a whisper, why I had not told them, and I said that when I had told them other things they had been received like inconvenient facts to be filed under phase or cute, and that the ritual of disclosure had made me feel exposed without being understood, and that my decision to hold the news had not been vindictive at first, only self-protective. Although I would not deny that tonight there was an element of precision in the withholding that tasted like justice because it allowed me to define the terms of this family conversation for the first time in years. She wanted me to promise that this was not permanent, that there would be a day when we would all sit together and toast my new chapter with a proper sense of ceremony, but before I could answer, Daniel walked into the kitchen with the purposeful stride of a person who mistakes confidence for correctness and asked, loud enough for the dining room to hear, whether the rumors of my sudden adulthood were true and whether I would be releasing a press statement or just continue to drop cryptic quotes like a midlife pop star teasing an album, and his wife laughed an octave too high, and my aunt appeared at the threshold with a Tupperware in her hands and the expression of a woman who has discovered a new soap opera to follow. I put the lid on the last container and placed it in the bag for Mrs. Klein, then turned to face them with the patience of someone who has rehearsed this moment not in front of a mirror, but in the long corridors of her own mind. And I said that I appreciated the attention, since there had been so little of it when I could have used a fraction, and that I understood the desire for clarity because uncertainty is uncomfortable, but that my life was not a public broadcast, and that if anyone here wanted to be part of it going forward, they would need to learn the discipline of asking questions that do not sound like accusations and giving congratulations that do not contain embedded advice. Daniel rolled his eyes and said I was being dramatic, and I replied that a mortgage servicer does not consider me dramatic on the first of the month, which drew a few startled laughs from the hallway and a bitter smile from my mother, who was realizing both the size and the solidity of the thing I had kept under wraps. The room went quiet in that dense way that means the next words will either burn the bridge or build a sturdier one, and I felt the tug to soothe, to tidy the edges, to offer everyone a tour date and a photo to post, but I resisted. Because the whole point of this revenge, if we must call it that, and perhaps we must, was to stop paying admission to a theater that always booked me as the understudy, and instead to let them sit with the discomfort of a curtain that would not rise on command. I picked up the bag for the neighbor and said I would deliver it, and as I stepped toward the back door, my father called my name with the weariness of a man who hates conflict but hates mystery more, and he asked, not unkindly, if I truly intended to keep them on the outside looking in, and I told him that doors are funny things, because they are not locked or open by nature, they are simply thresholds made meaningful by the rules we agree to follow when we cross them, and that I would be outside for 10 minutes, and when I returned I would sit down and make a proposal that, if accepted, would change how this family treats my life from this night forward, and that if rejected, well, it would clarify a great many things for all of us. When I came back in from the cold, the air outside having scrubbed my thoughts until they felt clean enough to say out loud without shaking, the house had settled into that hushed expectancy that follows an intermission when the audience knows the next act will decide whether the night becomes a memory or a regret, and I set the empty delivery bag on the counter, folded it with the same deliberate care I intended to bring to the conversation, and walked to the dining room where my family sat. With their bodies angled not quite casually, the tilt of their shoulders betraying a posture of readiness that would have been funny if it had not been so familiar. I remained standing, not out of theatrics, but because sitting among them often coaxed me into softening edges I needed to keep, and I said that I had, as promised, a proposal that would make the ground between us less treacherous, a set of terms that were simple in language and radical only in how consistently they would be applied, and I watched their faces steady themselves like swimmers at the edge of a pool who think the water will be colder than it is, and then jump anyway only to discover the shock is not from the temperature, but from the realization that they cannot touch bottom. The terms were not complicated, and I laid them out with the measured cadence I use when I want my words to land like stones that cannot be pushed aside, explaining first that comparisons would no longer be a form of family entertainment, that the ritualized elevation of one child at the expense of another would be retired like an old costume that had outlived whatever purpose it claimed to serve, and that any conversation that began with my brother's choices as a yardstick would be redirected or ended without apology. I added that questions about my life, my work, my home, or my relationships would be welcomed only when framed as curiosity rather than prosecution, and that unsolicited advice disguised as concern would not receive a reply even if delivered with a casserole. And finally, I said that invitations to the most important rooms of my life, literal and figurative doors, would be extended only to people who had proven they could enter without rearranging the furniture to suit their preferences, which meant that future access would be earned by behavior rather than granted by blood. No one spoke for a long beat, and in that silence I slid 3 envelopes across the table not as threats, but as tools, each holding a single printed page that restated the terms in plain words alongside a space for a signature. Because I knew that clarity is a kindness, and also that families have a way of forgetting agreements when those agreements are inconvenient, and I wanted something they could hold in their hands the next time muscle memory tried to write a different script. Daniel scoffed first, because of course he did, asking whether I really expected him to sign a contract just to have dinner with his sister, and I smiled in a way that was not unkind, but was certainly immovable, telling him that he could call it whatever made him feel the least threatened, an agreement, a courtesy, a line in the sand, and that if the idea of committing to not belittle me made his pen feel heavy, then perhaps that small heaviness was the most honest indicator we had of how easily old habits would reassert themselves once tonight had faded. My aunt tried to make a joke about non-disclosure agreements and celebrity relationships, which was almost witty, and my father rubbed the bridge of his nose like a man who has just been told the problem is real and cannot be argued into a different shape, while my mother looked down at the paper and then up at me with a mixture of defiance and grief that made me wish, for a breath, that this could have been simpler before, reminding myself that simplicity had never been the offer on this table. I told them that I did not need an answer tonight, that this was not a stunt or a trap, that I would accept signatures later if they needed time to think, and that in the meantime nothing would be taken from them except the right to assume knowledge they had not earned. And then, because I am my mother's daughter whether I like it or not, I poured coffee for everyone with a steady hand and let the steam rise like a benediction over a church that had finally agreed to replace its hymnals. What I did not do, though I saw the hunger for it in the tilt of every head, was hand them the address of the place where I now wake to morning light that lays itself across the floor like a patient animal. Nor did I produce photographs of a front door painted the exact color of courage. Nor did I tell them who laughs in the kitchen with me on Sundays when we make pancakes that never look like circles and talk about painting the spare room a pale green that makes the plants look like they have always lived there, because the point was not to starve them or to gloat. It was to establish that revelation in my life would no longer be demanded like a receipt at the exit, but offered, when offered, as a gift with the bow still intact. Still, because I am not cruel and because the truth has its own gravity, I allowed a single hint to slip into the room and take a chair, telling them that the notion of settled down had been wrongly framed all along as a prize you win when other people approve, when in fact it is a practice you undertake one responsible promise at a time, which, in my case, included paper with embossed seals, a ledger that balances under my own name, a set of keys that do not seek anyone else's permission to turn, and a vow spoken where it mattered, that my house, in every possible sense of the word, would be built without debt to doubt. My mother inhaled sharply at the phrasing. My father studied the grain of the table as if it could tell him what I was not saying, and Daniel asked, with the brittle brightness of someone who suddenly understands he may not be the main character, whether I was telling them I had gotten married or simply that I had become boring, and I laughed then, not unkindly, and said that if he needed a headline he could try this one. I chose a life that requires no translation. The signatures came in different ways, which felt fitting, because families rarely pivot in unison. My aunt signed immediately, more out of her love of order than any profound awakening. And my father signed after a long look that told me he was choosing the relationship over the ritual, and Daniel did not sign, though his wife did, in a small act of quiet rebellion that I suspected would be discussed loudly later. And my mother held the pen and the page without moving until finally she placed both on the table and said that she could not sign something that made her feel like a stranger to her own child, to which I answered that the feeling of estrangement had been mine for years, and that this was the road back if she wanted it. Then I kissed her cheek and told her I loved her enough to insist on the terms that would keep me present rather than resentful. I put on my coat, thanked everyone for dinner with a tone that was neither frosty nor effusive, and walked to the door with a kind of unhurried certainty that comes when the story you have been living in your head finally matches the story you are acting out in the room. And as I stepped into the night, the cold found my face and felt like permission rather than punishment. On the sidewalk, I took out my phone and saw a message that read simply, "Are you almost home?" which could mean a companion waiting with the porch light on, or a contractor confirming tomorrow's appointment to install bookshelves in a room that will hold the weight of future pages, or a friend who has become family reminding me that a seat is warm at a table where my news is met with celebration rather than comparison, and I let the ambiguity stand as a small shelter I could carry with me, a reminder that not all truths need to be unpacked in public to be real. Behind me, through the window, I could see them still at the table, heads bent over the papers that had become mirrors, and I knew the debates would begin before the coffee cooled. Arguments about control and respect and what constitutes love. But I also knew that the next invitation I sent would bear my return address, and that those who crossed my threshold would do so under a roof held up by the architecture of respect we had finally agreed to name. Whether my mother would sign tomorrow, next month, or never at all remained an open question, and in that unresolved space I felt not dread but a complicated peace, because my revenge had never been about punishment. It had been about authorship, and tonight I had written the ending in a sentence that leaves the door ajar. You may join me, if you can speak to me without erasing me, because I have already settled down in a life that answers to my name.